Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, it appears that Trump's dog and pony show regarding his standing as the leader of the free world has reached the point where he and members of his administration are willing to bring the world to a nuclear threshold in order to prop up his reputation and ego.
Yeah, it's a ridiculous problem, but it stems from the fact of the recent statement that Trump made on social media, um, where he talked about Russia's failing economy, about how Russia's military was useless because, frankly, they should have ended the war in a week. And then, of course, there was the situation where he talked about how Ukraine could win the war somehow and not just regain all the territory they lost, but also, of course, take parts of Russia apparently. So you can see a pattern there, and people were sort of questioning this, going, "Well, this is just Trump being Trump, and he's just trying to." Fan the flames a bit just to demoralize the Russians. But actually, it turns out, from what I understand, that there's mileage in what Trump says because there are all these ridiculous reports about Russia's economy failing, about all its refineries being destroyed, and it's running out of diesel petrol, and the country's collapsing. And also, just basically, we're back to this point where there's elements in the West going, well, Russia's taken hardly any territory, and they equate winning the war to taking territory, so they can't fight the war. They must be running out of munitions, and Putin's popularity is caving in and creating all the things that underpin the statements that Trump made. And it's now people believing it to be true. They think this is an accurate representation, and we're back to, well, if we just give the Ukrainians what they need, even though apparently they're being given everything they need for years and none of it's worked because every single game changer turned out to be useless. And tellingly, a recent GAO report proves that eloquently, that the US military, its hardware, etc., is just substandard. And there's a lot of deficiencies in not just in simple things like maintenance of equipment, but at the end of the day, if we're starting to hear those stories again, clearly there are elements in the Trump administration, for whatever reason, and I'm not going to try and explain what goes on in their heads because it's pointless, believe that somehow Russia's vulnerable, that Russia's economy is vulnerable, that Putin is vulnerable, that they can't keep this war going. So we can change the tide. We can give Ukraine what it wants, and somehow Ukraine's going to prevail and win the war. Not, of course, asking the fundamental question that no one in the West seems capable of asking themselves, is that Russia's always made the point, if at any juncture during the war it becomes an existential crisis of biblical proportions, then Russia will resort to using nuclear weapons. The other point is Russia's got the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. Russia is not going to capitulate on the basis of fighting an SMO the way it is now. If the absolute worst came to the worst, and I'm not saying it will, but we're saying for argument's sake, they're going to pull the nuclear doctrine out of the cupboard and use it. Because then the argument from their perspective is that way we'll turn the risk of a defeat into a victory, which from their perspective it most certainly would be. Goodness knows what would happen to Ukraine in the process, and we have to absolutely be clear. We don't want that to happen in any way, shape, or form because it would be utterly disastrous. But ironically, we're back to a statement I made on X again today, which was so many people in the West believe that Putin's a monster, but they don't think he's monster enough to utilize nuclear weapons and destroy Ukraine or destroy the West. And this is the biggest contradiction. Because if he's as a bigger monster as they believe he is, then why do they think he's not prepared to do so? I mean, they may think, well, it's mutually assured destruction, so he's not going to destroy himself in the process. But we're back to that point. That's a rather big quantum leap of judgment because we know Western nuclear facilities or weapons are very old. They're fragile. They're not safe by any stretch of the imagination. Huge sums of money have to be spent every year in terms of maintenance, whereas Russia has a very modern nuclear arsenal. Therefore, it's perfectly capable, in principle at least, of launching such an offensive and actually winning hands down. And there are enough elements in the US in the military who agree with that assessment in the US and go, there's no way we can do this, which is why they permanently keep saying to the Russians, no, we don't agree with that. No, we weren't responsible for that. No, that had nothing to do with this because they don't want to cross this, red line that exists. Or a number of really definitive red lines. Not the red lines people in the old media tell us are red lines, which aren't, because their basis of what's a red line is something that they've just invented in their minds to be true. There are actually very clear, specific red lines. One of them is if you do anything which endangers Russia in an existential manner, then we are going to respond with maximum force. They've made their position. Now, if people don't want to believe it, that's fine, but that doesn't detract from the fact, excuse me, that they're absolutely adamant that that's the case.
Yeah, I'm starting to also see this from a slightly different perspective. It's a form of projection by the West. They have certain elements that are talking into the ears of leaders such as Trump, Mertz, Starmer. Macron might be the only one who, in a certain respect, actually sees reality. But this understanding or this belief that Russia is economically down, that the sanctions are really harming them, that they don't have the military capabilities and readiness to continue the conflict. But the reality is that Russia continues to move forward. They have taken nearly every objective that they have, and as Ukraine and Kiev continues to hold out and push for a continuation of the conflict, then Russia just keeps moving, inevitably forward. The interesting thing when you take a look at it is uh, at the UN speech. I know not the UN speech. It was at the speech he had yesterday with all the generals and admirals and all the commanders. He said, if Russia was a real country and I was in charge of it, we would have bombed the hell out of Ukraine and it would have been over in a week. Well, that shows just how lack of understanding President Trump has in regards to anything military. And thus, he has this mindset, and it's really a scary mindset, that the United States has been successful, and that's what Hegseth said. We are the greatest military in the world. Nobody can touch us. There's not a single thing. We can do whatever we want. For all intents and purposes, that was what was said in front of the commanders. And with this mindset, it's almost like you think that if I decide on a goal or a course of action, all I've got to do is open this can of whoop ass, forgive my French. Just open this can of whoop, and automatically I will be successful. The enemy will be eradicated, and it's over. Not having a single iota of understanding of what it takes to do a conflict. The other reality is that Europe and the United States is divided. We are now in a government shutdown. We can't even pay our bills. So we're in a government shutdown. We're economically really in a recession. The America is divided in many different capacities, And Europe is the same way. You're starting to see protests. You're starting to see a number of different populations wanting to get out of this and focus on domestic issues. But on the other side, there are verifications from some really credible sources that say that the Russian people are 100% behind Putin. And in fact, they have an expectation that perhaps Russia should have gone even stronger and dealt with this mess in a much more powerful way. So Putin's got all the support behind him. The economics, while it may, of course, any time during a war cycle, see your economy start to slow or inflation start to rise a little bit, it's not enough to really affect the domestic economy to the point where the people now are demanding it to end. They're still willing to see it go through to the final outcome.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And then it comes on to this point where people can say, well, this is just part of the rhetoric. But, you know, let's clarify this at this point in time. The US has not stated they are going to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. But then there were statements made by personnel inside the administration. Well, we didn't say we will, but we didn't say we won't. And there was all these vague references to the fact of considering it. Now, one can easily surmise again, this is just a psyop to try and unnerve the Russians, but it won't unnerve the Russians because the Russians have made the point. If, for argument's sake, you decide to give Tomahawks to Ukraine, if they utilize those Tomahawks, then you, the United States, are going to be at war with us, Russia. That is a given. It is going to happen. That is not a let's have a fight and try and invade the United States or vice versa. That's the nuclear doctrines implemented immediately, and we're at World War III nuclear war scenario, irrefutably the case. Because part of the problem with this is one thing the Russians didn't care particularly about the ATACMS or those kind of missiles. The problem with the Tomahawks, yeah, they're very slow. They're subsonic, but the problem is you can put a nuclear warhead on it. Now, with all due respect, if a Tomahawk starts flying in and heading towards Moscow, they don't know whether it's got a nuclear warhead or not on it. They're not going to sit around and wait for, well, let's just see where it hits first and then make an assessment afterwards. Now, irrefutably, there must be elements in Russia, in the United States, who are aware of this. But again, the problem is that people are now getting emboldened. And the question is what's the difference between a psyop and them actually emboldened to the point they think they can make these kind of statements and Russia's going to cave in? And the answer is they don't know this. They just believing what they want to believe to be true. But if this is indeed a credible threat and it happens, and we absolutely have to be crystal clear, nobody who's remotely sane would want this to happen because Russia would respond this way, and they've made this position very, very clear on multiple occasions. That's not a threat, it's a promise. That really is a red line. The whole issue of ATACMS being red lines is just people in alt media making up stories. There's no basis in reality for it whatsoever. But Tomahawk's an entirely different matter because they have a range of what, 2,000 kilometers? 2.5? They can hit Moscow easily. That's a major population center. And as I said, it might have a conventional warhead on it. And yes, the S-500s will probably shoot it down. But the Russians are going to wait to find out. And the response is going to be devastating. And the problem is that the response could then be to the United States. Well, you provided the weapons, and here's the other thing: they would have to launch these on behalf, in inverted commas, of the Ukrainians. So if they do that, then they are culpable of being directly, not indirectly, at war because it's a weapon of mass destruction. It's a weapon of significant destruction. You put a nuclear warhead on, you're talking something entirely different. So it's all well and good that these statements get made. But in the past, we've talked about them, people, blowing hot air about things. But in light of recent developments and this understanding that there increasingly are elements inside the Trump administration who are starting to believe all this hype that Russia can't continue the war for much longer, then these sort of hot air rhetoric starting to sound a bit menacing, and therefore it will be taken a lot more seriously, and we can't therefore on that basis say definitively that some idiot wouldn't consider doing this. But if they do, then the consequences will be absolutely devastating because it won't be a special military operation anymore. It'll be a fully fledged world war, and Russia will respond with all the firepower they have of a nuclear arsenal that the West has absolutely no defense of. And someone somewhere needs to get a grip of people in the Trump administration and say to them, listen, you need to shut up making these comments because you do not understand what you are dealing with. You don't grasp that the reason Russia is fighting an SMO and not obliterating everything is because that's their intention. Could they obliterate everything? Yes, including countries in the West, very easily. You have to take this seriously, but you can tell there was a time when you think with Trump, he makes statements, oh, it's all just hot. But having heard the fact that there is increasing belief that there's mileage behind why he's saying it, then all of a sudden, if you don't think it's just a lot of hot air, then you have to start to be far more concerned about the nature of what he's saying and what the potential ramifications are. So we very much stand by the title of this, that the US provokes a nuclear response from Russia, because that's what exactly they risk provoking.
Yeah, because you have to think that at a certain point, there's political rhetoric and there's saber rattling and there's a whole nine yards. But either if you do it for too long, you either embolden your quote unquote allies and enemies to start taking things on their own, knowing that you don't have the capacity to either stop them or to intervene. We perhaps are seeing this in West Asia, in many different instances. But the take a look at Zelensky. Zelensky comes out and immediately there's a secret meeting or a secret talk that Trump had with him. Oh, he just blasted out. Oh yeah, looks like we're going to get tomahawks and we're going to be able to extend this conflict. You have Rutt who comes out and says that we are at war. I mean, pretty much just saying we are at war with Russia. Well, if I'm Russia and you have the leader of NATO pretty much coming out and saying that, okay, I guess we're at war. Then I can do what I want. You have Mertz coming out and saying, "Oh, we can no longer have peace with Russia in any capacity." Well, Russia then, is going to cut them off at the knees for forever as long as these leaders are in there. Then, of course, you have at the UN, we're talking about using these tomahawks. You have Vice President Vance coming out of the woodwork now. He's going to toe the party line, but I have not really heard him come out and say anything really in the past, but inevitably he says they could be used. So he's now pushing the line. Kellogg, we know, is off on his own little thing.
Well,
The
anyway, it
yeah,
is what it is with it.
yeah. But the point at the end is either somebody somewhere could be emboldened to make a mistake, and I'll go ahead and end this with here. You have to wonder if a couple days ago, this massive drone and missile attack that Russia conducted was a way to tell the West, hey, we're just fine to continue the readiness of our military.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that as a final point myself. They also made the point, I think it was Putin said a couple of days ago, we're not fighting a proper war. We're really contained in what we're doing. We could go a lot further than we are. And that's something the West just hasn't grasped for the last 3.5 years. They don't realize Russia's fighting intentionally from their own perspective with the one arm tied behind their back, deliberately. And that's very hard for people in the West to accept to be reality. But it is, and the West needs to just wise up to the fact that, you do not want to push this too far because the consequences could be devastating. And therefore, we have to take things based on these discussions, these conversations that where largely it has been by the admission of the West hot air in the past. I think there's an element of desperation creeping in the West, not least because the West is now bankrupt, basically, and that's we've talked about the US being out there with a begging bowl, which is absolutely the case. So this adds a whole new dimension to the equation, but the US is risking massive provocation. And, if you think Putin's unstable and people do in the West, then, why are you trying to antagonize someone who's as unstable as you think they are? I mean, where's the logic in that? There is no logic. So, people in the West have to start taking this more seriously and going, just stop doing this. If you want to end the war, do not create these kind of high octane provocative statements because you just don't know where it could end up.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's kind of funny that the U.S. may think that Russia is not prepared, but they end up bringing all the commanders over just to tell them that we're the greatest in the world. And oh, by the way, you're too fat.
Oh,
So,
yes, there was that too.
anyway, Paul, as always, thank you very much for being a part of this discussion and for your insights.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.